If you clicked on this YouTube video featuring an airplane in the thumbnail, chances are you probably know the whole Boeing-Airbus Duopoly story. How Airbus was created by a consortium of European countries to challenge American dominance, how the two have dominated the commercial aircraft industry for decades, how they've lobbed accusations of unfair government subsidies back and forth, and how Airbus has recently pulled ahead as Boeing sort of haphazardly lurches from one PR nightmare to the next. In an industry that has ridiculously high barriers to entry, many argue that this was a natural outcome, that the economics of aircraft manufacturing pushed the entire industry towards a natural monopoly, or duopoly in this case. What wasn't inevitable was this particular configuration. There was a moment in the late 60s and early 70s that could have resulted in an alternate USA dominant timeline, where Airbus was not a David who rose to challenge the Boeing Goliath, but a footnote in the pages of aviation history. And in a twist worthy of an HBO drama, it was the US government itself that handed David his slingshot. Let's start here, the Boeing 747. On top of being one of the most iconic planes of all time, the 747 marked the beginning of the jumbo jet age and earned the nickname Queen of the Skies. See, the research and development for what eventually became the 747 came directly from a military contract in 1964, when the US Air Force paid Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas to create proposals for a truly gargantuan cargo plane. Lockheed ultimately won the contract, so Boeing took its own plans, repurposed them for civilian use, and launched the 747 just a few years later. The same is true for almost any commercial plane made by a US manufacturer from World War II onward. When the end of the war threatened to decimate the industry, the government, and especially the US Air Force, stepped in, which is how we got You can see the logic here. Keeping a governmental military aerospace industry going even during peacetime would be prohibitively expensive. So fusing it with the civilian side ensures a steady supply of warplanes, missiles, etc. should the need arise. Plus, the industry was, and still is, absurdly valuable, to the tune of some hundreds of billions of dollars annually, so what government would want to let that die? But it went beyond that. Through things like loan guarantees, nudging airlines to buy one plane over the other, and meddling in sales to foreign companies, the dividing line between the government and aircraft manufacturing became so indistinct that, in some cases, the government dictated corporate management structure or even the selection of top-level company managers. Oh, and don't take my word for it. Check the description box below for a link to all of these sources and then some. It's this intense involvement that some, notably the top brass at Airbus, have criticized as heavy-handed and possibly illegal subsidies that topsy-turvy the market in favor of Boeing. Even back then, some Americans side-eyed this cozy relationship as tantamount to war profiteering. Regardless, the results on the industry were the same. Consistent, reliable incomes from their military sides allowed companies to take risks on their commercial sides that they might not have otherwise. But even with all the help, it was pretty clear that in the post-World War II landscape, not all of these companies could succeed. The US had plenty of airports, airlines, and people wanting to fly, but still. To be profitable, all these companies would need to produce far more planes than even the largest domestic market could possibly need. Way back in 1953, one industry analyst wrote, "It is pretty clear that all three builders cannot stay in this market. The first question is which of the three, Douglas, Lockheed, or Boeing, is going to drop out?" So this is the state of the industry in the mid to late 1960s. In Europe, Airbus is gearing up for launch. And in the US, the big three manufacturers are using military R&D funding to learn all about making big old planes. Which brings us back to the Queen. While she eventually became an icon, she was almost a fatal error. Pan Am ordered 25 of these in 1966, but Boeing didn't sell any more between 69 and 72. Airlines really wondered whether they could consistently fill these behemoths enough to justify the cost of flying them. So in that time, Boeing slashed 64,000 jobs and relied on other parts of the business, namely its military division, to cushion the blow. Why build a plane that many airlines didn't seem to want to buy? Well, first, it was basically done and ready to go thanks to the military R&D contract. And that's a hugely costly and time-consuming part of this whole process. And secondly, back then, airlines had more reason to just buy new planes whether or not they actually needed them in the fleet. Up until 1978, the US government controlled the routes that planes were allowed to fly and the fares that they could charge. So airlines had to compete on other things, like the types of planes that they flew. When one airline bought a cool new plane, other airlines felt pressure to do the same to attract customers. I mean, look at the cool interiors of the early 747.
Only one airline has the piano bar.
If you're a flyer in the 1960s or 70s, you might prefer that airline over the other one on that basis alone. Like Boeing, Lockheed and Douglas, which became McDonnell Douglas in 1967, really believed that their long-term success hinged on the successful introduction of a large, wide-body plane. Even though, again, plenty of airlines did not want any more gigantic planes. Specifically, an American Airlines exec named Franklin Kolk, remember him, came up with a plan for a slightly smaller but still wide-body plane with just 2 engines. It would cost less to buy, maintain, and operate, and could reliably be filled to cover shorter distances, like New York to Chicago. But one airline, Trans World Airlines, insisted on a model that could fly coast-to-coast nonstop, even though it had already ordered several 747s for exactly that purpose. TWA prevailed for reasons unclear even to the other participating airlines. And what happened next injured each of the 3 suppliers, but left in their wake an opportunity for European companies to become something they had never been, a competitive threat to the Americans. Meet the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, wide-body, long-range jets featuring 3 turbofan jet engines, capable of carrying 250 to 400 passengers depending. They were a bit smaller than the 747 and certainly more economical considering they had 1 fewer engine. But they were so similar that one economist called them all but indistinguishable, which is a problem in this industry because the size of the plane and the number of engines determines the route that the planes are able to fly. You wouldn't want to pay for the fuel to take one of these babies on a short to medium route, and you might not even be able to reliably fill it up all the way if not enough people consistently want to go from, say, Pittsburgh to Nashville. So these planes were competing directly with one another for the same routes, and were even large enough and long-range enough to compete with some of the routes dominated by the 747. So why did Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas decide to go head-to-head in what turned out to be a catastrophic competition to introduce these gigantic wide-body Trijets, when one of them could have instead focused on creating a slightly smaller but still wide-body twin jet that several airlines had specifically requested? Well, one argument is that they only did it because they knew they could rely on their military life preservers in case it went poorly, which it did. So why not take the risk? And the US government, despite being thoroughly enmeshed in the industry by this point, decided to take a hands-off approach to this one. This is the part where the US government shot its own aviation industry in the foot. See, back in 1953, the FAA created a rule that planes with only 2 engines were only allowed to fly 60 minutes flying time away from a diversionary airport in case one of its engines crapped out. But that rule was made in response to the much less reliable piston engines, not the much more reliable turbofan jet engines on the 747, the DC-10, and the L-1011 TriStar. So Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas were really disincentivized from creating twin-engine planes. Just pop on another engine up here and boom, now these planes can go virtually anywhere, at the cost of being more expensive to buy, fuel, and maintain for airline companies. Of course, in the following decades, the FAA loosened up that 60-minute rule such that twin-engine planes now fly virtually all over the world. But hindsight's 20/20, you know? But back then, you know who wasn't hamstrung by a 60-minute rule? Airbus had an advantage because its regulatory body, the International Civil Aviation Organization, itself a division of the United Nations, had a 90-minute rule for planes with 2 engines. So while Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas avoided the creation of twin-engine planes, Airbus mastered it. Meet the Airbus A300, the first wide-body twin-engine jet. Slightly smaller than these 3, it started taking longer and longer flights across Europe and Asia during the mid-1970s. In 1975, the Airbus A300 outsold the L-1011 and DC-10 combined. And in late 1977, Airbus got its foothold in the US market by letting cash-strapped Eastern Airlines fly A300s free of charge for 6 months. Right in time for the FAA to loosen up that 60-minute rule to 75 minutes for select flights. So in flew the Airbus A300 to fill this wide-body, twin-engined, jet-shaped market gap between the much smaller predecessors and the gigantic 747, L-1011, and DC-10. And in a real twist of the knife, the design for a wide-body twin created by the American Airlines exec Franklin Kolk became the basis for the Airbus A300. Lockheed never produced a wide-body twin and only sold 250 of the L-1011 TriStars before pulling out of the commercial side altogether in 1984. Douglas, which became McDonnell Douglas in a merger in 1967, was actually this close to creating their own wide-body twin. Throughout the 1960s, they developed plans to convert the DC-10 Trijet into the DC-10 twin. They even held a whole crazy showcase in Long Beach in 1971 featuring real-life human twins to show off the plane for some reason. Just imagine this without a third engine up here. That's pretty much what it would have been. And several European airlines expressed interest, so McDonnell Douglas could have been to Europe what Airbus eventually became to the United States. But lacking any American buyers, several top brass at McDonnell Douglas put the kibosh on the plane. McDonnell Douglas only sold about 400 of these DC-10 Trijets, and with its commercial division on death's door, it merged with Boeing in 1997. And finally, Boeing didn't release its own wide-body twin, the 767, until September 1982. And the rest is history. Airbus clawed its way up to become Boeing's arch nemesis, and top executives at both Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas wallowed in shame and regret, I assume. That was a little bit of editorializing for you. Today, Airbus and Boeing dominate 90% of the global commercial aircraft market, even as back-to-back failures create PR nightmares for Boeing. Some wonder whether China's Comac, a relatively new state-owned company, could become a serious competitor, what with its massive domestic market and nigh-on unlimited government support. But until then, happy flying and stay safe out there. Are you the type to check what plane you'll be on before buying airline tickets? Tell us in the comments below. My husband is. Also, feel free to roast me for the size discrepancy between the A300 and the 747. I mean, yeah, this one should be a lot bigger. I apologize. It's just, what can you do?